The Boy in the Alamo. Chapter 4, we ride into the fort. Before sunrise, the volunteers were oiling their guns and saddling their horses as they made ready to break camp. Buck sent me to the river to wash. When I came back, he said, "Don't look to me now. You've said you were a man. You'll have to stand on your own feet and be a man. So don't come traipsing after me. You hear?" "Yes," I said. I got my own fish to fry," Buck told me. "I don't want to tag along." "All right," I said. "If you get scared," Buck said, "don't show it any. I'd be ashamed." "I'm not afraid," I said. But I guess I was, somewhat. "And don't get underfoot. Stay clear of trouble." "I promise," I said. Buck put out his hand. We shook hands for the first time, I reckon. Then he turned his heel and left me. Colonel Crockett was standing in the middle of the bivouac. "You, Billy," he hollered. "Get over here." "Yes, sir," I said. I hated it when Aunt Elvira called me Billy, but it sounded different when Colonel Crockett yelled it out that way. I went up to him, double quick. "What do you think of your mount?" he asked me, and the Indian led up a little gray donkey. I had hoped for a horse, but I didn't show it. "Fine," I said. "I'm much obliged." "Whoa, Pedro," said Colonel Crockett, and held the donkey's head for me to get on. There was no saddle and only a rope bridle and reins. I scrambled up on the donkey's back. Pedro began to wheel and plunge around, and I had to hang on for dear life while he bucked in a circle, throwing his hoofs in the air and charging at the mesquite trees. Before I knew it, he had scraped me off against a wall, and I was lying on my back in the dust. All the volunteers roared and laughed and slapped their legs and each other's backs. I was mad enough to bust. Pedro stood quietly by the tree. He was already grazing the new grass. "I'll show you, you ornery critter," I yelled out. I laid hold of the rope reins and jerked him around and started to climb on again. Colonel Crockett quit laughing and came over to me. "You'll have to ride him on the hind quarters, boy," he said. "Seeing as you've got no stirrups, sit to the rear, and he'll go peaceable." I scrounged back, and my long legs hung down around my donkey's hind legs, but he stood quietly. The volunteers mounted their horses and formed a column. "Bring up the rear, Billy," ordered Colonel Crockett, who was riding at the head of the column. "Yes, sir," I said as they started off. "Giddy up," I said. Pedro didn't move. The horses pounded on and disappeared in a cloud of dust, and I stayed behind. "Giddy up, you!" I shouted and slapped Pedro with the reins. Still, he balked. The column slowed to a canter, and then Colonel Crockett called a halt. He turned his horse and rode back. He looked at me disgusted. "Reckon you'll have to build a fire under him," he said. "Thought you were a man." "I'll make him go," I cried. My shame came out in my red face. I dug my heels into Pedro's flank, and I jerked up the reins. "Vamos!" I shouted. Suddenly he shot off after the horses and showed Colonel Crockett a clean pair of hoofs. Pedro ran as if something was after him. He laid his ears back and tore through the mesquite bushes, and I could hardly manage to hang on. I was first sliding off on his hindquarters, and then I was jostled forward to his middle, and I had to hook my feet together under his stomach just to stay on. "If you throw me again, I'll break your neck," I said to him, gritting my teeth and sawing the reins back and forth to slow him. We raced past the horses before I could turn his head. Even Buck was bent double with laughing. Finally, I inched forward on his neck and put my hands over his eyes, and he stopped short, and I just near about went over his head. Colonel Crockett rode forward. "You'll have to manage your horse better than that," he said to me in a cold, stern way. "I don't want any of my volunteers to be the laughing stock of Bayard." "Yes, sir," I said. "I think I can gentle him." I got off then, and I went and stood at his head. I rubbed his long ears, and I patted his soft nose, and it was like gray velvet. He had big black eyes and strong yellow teeth. "Pedro," I said. "Please pay attention to me. I won't hurt you. Let's be friends." I wished for a piece of sugar, but since I had none, I plucked up a few handfuls of grass, and I fed him. He nibbled at my fingers, and when I turned my back, he nuzzled my shoulder, as if he understood. When I got on again, he had steadied, and we trotted up to the rear of the column and followed along as we were intended. From that time on, I was his master, but I never treated him roughly. He had a tender mouth for the bridle, and he had to get used to my ways. The town of San Antonio de Bayar was full of low white houses built around open courts with trees and flowers. The spring had set in early there, and flowers were in bloom. I remember the pink oleanders and a big red flowered the hibiscus. It was such a city as I had never seen, coming from the log house of Nacogdoches. The houses of San Antonio de Bayar were made of adobe, whitewashed, or of white stone. They had flat roofs on which the people could come out to stand in the brilliant sunshine and watch us pass. The people were dressed in bright colors, and the plaza was filled with strange folks coming and going, monks in long brown robes or black habits, women wearing shawls and mantillas over their heads, Mexican peddlers selling food and cloth and crockery, Indian peons in leather sandals. There were sounds of morning marketing and the cries of children and the whinnies of burros. The burros were loaded with bundles of water jars and provisions strapped over them. The church bells rang out on the soft air. As we rode along 16 strong, a sullen silence fell on the marketplace. The people stopped to stare at us. Colonel Crockett sat very straight on his horse, his steel blue eyes looking neither to the right nor the left, the tail of his coonskin hat flicking back and forth. We did as he did. I sat straight as I could on the rump of Pedro. About half a mile northeast of town, we came to the Alamo, the chapel of the old Spanish mission, which was now the fort in Texas hands. The chapel was a low gray building with a curving pediment and arched windows with stone columns beside the door. A new flag was flying from its southwest corner. It was a red, white, and green banner with the numbers 1824 on its white bar. Ditches had been dug around the chapel and earthworks thrown up against the walls to make them stronger. Cannon poked their muzzles over the tops of the flat walls, and we could see the heads of men who stood on scaffolding inside the walls, pointing their muskets. When Colonel Crockett gave the signal, we galloped toward the fort and through the big main gate into open space behind the chapel. When we were inside, the gate was banged shut and locked. All the people in the fortress raised a cheer. Colonel Crockett replied with an Indian war whoop, and we echoed him. A tall, thin man with red hair, wearing the blue uniform of a cavalry officer, came forward to meet us. Colonel Crockett got off of his horse, and the other officer put out his hand. "We heard you were expecting trouble," Davy Crockett said. "I'm Crockett, Colonel Crockett, better known as Davy." "I am Colonel Travis," said the redhead man. "William Barrett Travis, at your service. Welcome to the Alamo. We do expect trouble, and soon." "These are my Tennessee boys," Davy said, and introduced the men all around. "And who is this?" Colonel Travis asked, inspecting me as I stood at the head of my donkey. "This is Billy Campbell," Davy said. He laughed. "We found him in the bulrushes." "How old are you, Billy?" Colonel Travis asked me. "I'm going on 13, I said. "They send me children," Colonel Travis said, and shook his head sadly. By this time the men had poured out of the barracks and were hanging over the walls, waving at us and grinning, for everyone had heard of Davy Crockett and the wild frontier. "Speech! Speech!" they began to shout. Davy took off his coonskin hat and said, "Gentlemen, we are glad to be here, and thank you for your welcome. I've come here to prove that I am a true Texian, though it looks like I picked a mighty bad time to do it. I've been a duly elected congressman from my district in Tennessee, as you may know. I don't mention this because I want votes. I don't intend to run either for office or safety. I mention it because I want to tell you that I'm after an even higher honor now. That's the honor of being a private in this garrison and defending the liberty of the country. I and my men are mostly from Kentucky and Tennessee, and we aim to prove that those states deserve the name they have for rearing men that are half horse, half alligator, and can give a good account of themselves in a fight. A rousing cheer went up when Davy had finished talking, and they crowded around him to shake his hand. Colonel James Bowie came up then. He was a thin man, tall and pale, with a glossy head of chestnut hair and deep, sad eyes. Though he was known as the Fighting Devil, he spoke softly in the tones of a gentleman, and he looked as if he might be ill. "Colonel Crockett, sir, we are glad to have you come, and I hope you do not live to regret it." "So long as I live," said Davy Crockett, and gave his big booming laugh. Along with the soldiers, of which there must have been near 150, I saw several women, half a dozen children, mostly Mexicans, and 2 black men who were the body servants of Colonel Travis and Colonel Bowie. The Mexican boys stared at me like frightened rabbits, but a little girl came over and said, "Buenos dias," which I knew was the Mexican for good day. I wished she would go away, for I did not know how to speak her language. Then she spoke to me in English. "Hello, what is your name?" she asked. "William Harkness Campbell," I said. "I am Guadalupe," she said. "Play with me." "I don't have time," I told her. She made a face and ran off. I found she was the daughter of Captain Mendoza, a Mexican volunteer who had declared for Texas, and she had learned English in the convent school. She was younger than I, no more than 10 years old. I guess you would say she was a pretty girl. She had big black eyes like pansies, and long black hair looped up with a red ribbon, and a little face like a valentine simile. But I did not want to be bothered by a girl. I had found them a trouble, and you never could tell what was in their minds to do next. When the welcome was over, Colonel Travis assigned us to quarters. The volunteers went into the bivouac at the left of the large enclosure, but when I tried to follow them, I found I was to be with the women and children. We were in 2 rooms in one of the storehouses, and I was bedded down with 3 young ones, Juan Pablo and Diego Gutierrez. Mrs. Dickinson and her baby, and Mrs. Mendoza and some other Mexican women and Lupe were in the other. I felt strange and lonely, as I had never been in such close quarters with women or children. I left them as soon as I could and went back to the big open yard by the barracks, where they were butchering a beef for supper. The pit was dug and a fire built, and several members of the garrison were cooking. Usually, the new recruits to the fort were required to cook, but Davy Crockett was such a great man, he and his volunteers were company that night. As I walked around the enclosure, I heard somebody sing-songing, "William Campbell, William Campbell," like a poll parrot. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the voice. Suddenly I looked up on the scaffolding before the walls, and there was Lupe Mendoza climbing around it like a monkey. I paid her no attention, and Miss Mendoza came out and screamed at her, "Lupe!" Finally, Lupe climbed down, taking her own good time, and her mother grabbed her ear and marched her to her quarters. As she passed me by, I couldn't help but laughing. Lupe stuck out her tongue and made a face at me.